you've already thrown out there a few times the term social justice B. In the book, you draw a contrast between, like I said before, some of the different strains of social justice that we can see in our world today, and in the church and being practiced and so on, that you call social justice A and social justice B. Can you explain for our audience what you mean by those, and how you then, after differentiating, kind of trace these two different ideas in the book?
Yeah, so the short version, again, there's a huge hubbub about what's the right term, anti-racist, CRT, should Christians even use a term like social justice, which, just as a historical fun fact, was coined by a Christian political philosopher over 200 years ago, later got hijacked by Marxists in the 20th century. For me, that debate just isn't that interesting. So I coined a distinction between social justice A, which broadly speaking is the kind of justice pursuits that jive with a biblical worldview. So examples I give in the book, this would be, in the early church, first century, if we time warped back, you have unwanted Roman babies who were tossed aside like garbage in literal garbage heaps, like trash dumps in the first century. And so our brothers and sisters 2,000 years ago realized, like, wait a second, I've read Ephesians 1. God the Father called me unblemished. He has declared me blameless. He has adopted me as his beloved son or daughter. So now we're going to take that vertical gospel and expand its implications horizontally. We're going to go to the literal human dumps. We're going to adopt these unwanted babies and raise them as cherished sons and daughters. And within 2 generations, the early church abolished the human dump and infanticide system across the Roman Empire. Yeah. That's what I'm getting at with social justice A. Or fast forward to, obvious examples like Fred Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman in the U.S., spearheading the abolitionist movement. In the U.K., William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect, who, not in spite of, but because of their deep biblical faith, they said, wait a second, how are we treating image bearers of God who have irreducible value, dignity, and worth? How do we treat them like property? That can't stand. Or in the 20th century, Christians like Václav Havel in the Czech Republic, who stood up to communism, Christians like Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Soviet Union, who stood up to communism, Germans like Sophie Scholl and her brother Hans, who started the White Rose Society to stand up to Hitler and his minions, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the resistance, fighting the Third Reich. Yeah. So there's a rich history that Christians can tap into of our brothers and sisters who've taken Scripture's commands, not suggestions, Scripture's commands to do justice seriously. And that legacy stretches on to today. In some of my research for the book, I found that Christians are number one of any demographic when it comes to giving to the poor, not just financially, but giving their time, giving resources, and being willing to leave their comfort zone and travel overseas to serve the poor. That's this social justice A legacy I'm talking about. There was a study that I cite in a recent book by the Gospel Coalition. I did a chapter on social justice. It's this book right here, Before You Lose Your Faith, edited by Ivan Mesa. And in this book, I document the fact that in Philadelphia, 12 faith communities, just 12, generated over $50 million of economic benefits for their surrounding communities in a single year.
Wow.
Over 50 million in 12 months, just 12 faith communities. So again, that's this legacy that, thank God, continues into the present of social justice A. Christians leading in the adoption and foster care worlds. Examples could go on and on. Social justice B is very different. I mean, the shorthand definition is It's a kind of justice pursuits that are deeply incompatible with Scripture. And so this would be just one or two quick examples. If I believe that I get to be sovereign over my identity, and I get to be sovereign over the meaning of my own biology, and I define myself a certain way, and somebody comes along and doesn't agree with my sovereignly self-defined identity, I am therefore oppressed. They are therefore my oppressor, reinforcing the hegemonic power of a heteronormative cisgender culture or something like that. So now I'm automatically the oppressed because my self-definition hasn't been validated. Even just giving an example like that, you can already start to hear, like, I'm talking about two completely different things. Mm-hmm. Both can be branded social justice, but there's a night and day contrast. Let me give just one more quick example. There's a best-selling author, Christian author, with one of the most listened to podcasts in the country. I won't name him. We actually have the same editor at Zondervan. And on his podcast, this was a couple years ago when the John MacArthur and company released what was called the Statement on Social Justice and the Gospel. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Did that show up on your radar? Yeah, the Statement on Social Justice and the Gospel.
Yeah.
At the time, I was working on this book, and so I tuned into this podcast discussing it. And the host spent, I want to say in the ballpark of a half an hour, fixated on the word the. The fact that it was titled The Statement on Social Justice and the Gospel, wrapped up in those three little letters and wrapped up in that definite article, was all the proof that this host needed that it was white supremacist, that it was trying to colonize black minds, that it was fundamentalist in all the wrong ways. And so here's where I'm going with this, is Scripture says in 1 Corinthians 13, you know, the famous wedding passage, that love is not easily offended. One of the marks of social justice B is it actually trains you. It conditions your synapses to be offended at virtually everything, to read into things, to find the hidden patriarchal oppression, to find the hidden racism, to find the hidden homophobia, oftentimes when it's not there. Sometimes it is, but it often isn't. Yeah. And so when I heard that podcast, it got me thinking, like, man, Scripture calls us to be charitable with each other. Where is this, what frankly is tantamount to slander, calling these brothers white supremacists? Where is this coming from? Because it's clearly not coming from Scripture. And the longer I dug into the sources that are recommended by this host and people in his circle, it became obvious. This is just straight up Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida style postmodern deconstructionism, which, let me just unpack that mouthful. I'm sure some of your listeners are familiar with that, but it's the idea that any truth claim, in the words of Michel Foucault, should be, quote, unmasked for what it really is, which is a power play. Yeah. So we need to deconstruct every statement for what it really is. Once you take the mask off, you see that John MacArthur and his crowd were really just trying to assert their white supremacy by using the word the. This is the stuff we're seeing unfold all over culture right now. Yeah. It didn't spring into existence out of a vacuum. This is the stuff that was all the rage in France in the 50s and 60s and swept through American universities in the 70s and 80s and now has become the zeitgeist.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's you can see in it, and I think that example that you shared is just perfect. I think that you can see this very this almost it's the same kind of spirit that you see in the hardcore believers in a conspiracy theory.
Yes,
right. That same kind of cynicism, suspicion, and being able to latch on to one, like that 3-letter word, like you said, and pull so much more out of it than was ever intended or ever meant to be in it. And
And it becomes unfalsifiable, right? At that point, once I've already, the way I describe it in part 4 of the book is think of social justice be like an operating system on your computer. It's a mental operating system. And once you download it, you become an instant expert on all kinds of complex questions, so long as you memorize about a dozen phrases. If you can say, well, that's just patriarchal oppression. Oh, you're just manifesting your white fragility. Oh, you're suffering from white privilege. If it's a brother or sister of color who's making an objection to the theory, then the mental OS kicks in and gives you a few new words like, oh, you've just internalized racism, or you're an Uncle Tom, or you suffer from subconscious bias or something like that. That it's an unfalsifiable system, because once people have downloaded it, it has no limiting principles. It has no limiting principles. So at the end of the day, everything becomes about oppression all the time. And that's the part that breaks my heart. When I see students of mine who get swept up in this, and the joy, the light in their eyes is extinguished because they're chronically triggered, because they're interpreting everything as cis, hetero, patriarchal white supremacy all the time. It's just sad. It's mean. It's frankly mean to teach that ideology to young people, or really to anybody.
Yeah.